tuning into BaisWave.
Welcome to the newest episode of Everything IS, where we talk about everything there is to know about studying international studies at Leiden University. I am Annika, a second-year IS student, and I will be your host today. Now, let's dive into the two regions we will discuss, which is Latin America and Europe. What's your name?
Hi, I'm Philip.
Which region are you studying?
I'm studying Europe.
Okay, let's just dive right in. I feel like Europe is often seen in IS, but general as a familiar or easy region to understand. What is something that you think actually makes it quite a complex region to study?
There are a bunch of things which people, I think, just kind of assume about Europe that they think, especially people from Europe and the Netherlands who are studying at Leiden University, that this is going to be an easy course, something that's not especially groundbreaking. But the thing is that we dive into European history, parts of European history which isn't usually taught in high school. We tend to explore, especially in history Europe, especially how history in Europe was written. Not necessarily what happened, but the ways in which it was interpreted afterwards. So, for instance, the aftermath of World War II and how that shaped national myths, like the ways in which nations envision themselves. And I found that very interesting. At the same time, we also dive a lot into the context of the Cold War in Europe, which is something that I feel gets skipped a lot in high school curricula. You usually talk about the United States and you talk about the Soviet Union and you talk about the conflict in the essentially like third world countries. But the thing is that in Europe, there were like homegrown massive movements and massive social changes occurring the entire time. And it was very interesting to kind of see all of these different ways in which people express themselves in that time and like how political ideology was shaped.
It does sound very interesting. Europe is also quite a big region. Would you say you focus on Western Europe, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe, or is there one where most of the focus lies?
Most of the focus usually is in Western Europe, which is also acknowledged by a lot of our lecturers, professors, and tutors as a massive shortcoming of the current curriculum is the fact that, for instance, Eastern Europe isn't discussed as much. And as a person from Eastern Europe, that hits close to home. But it is honestly very nice to kind of see that the program is kind of branching out in the last couple of months and years in the ways it's been developed. The inclusion, especially of Southern European countries, so the Mediterranean countries like Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and even Turkey. So these are all also discussed. Eastern Europe does get mentioned from time to time, but it's treated as this entire whole. And that's something that we also explore in Cultural Language Europe, the idea of Eastern Europe being the Orient of Europe, kind of where civilization ends. And I thought that that was like a very interesting way of looking at how Western Europe conceptualizes Eastern Europe. But yeah, the focus is overwhelmingly on Western Europe because those were, you could say, the makers and shakers of history in a lot of ways. So yeah.
But it's good to hear it's at least kind of branching out. And for essay topics, do you have the opportunity to choose countries in Eastern Europe, for example, to dive deeper into it?
Absolutely. It's not a Western European exclusive region. It's just that a lot of the times, most of the material that's written about Europe is from a Western European perspective on Western Europe. So there isn't as much literature, especially in English, which is important for a program that is taught in English, about Eastern Europe or Southern Europe for that matter. However, you can choose whichever country you want to. For instance, for my History Europe final assignment, I wrote essentially a bibliography and an argumentative essay whose thesis relied fully on Eastern Europe. I used Eastern European case studies only from the 1920s and 1930s. So yeah, no, you absolutely can branch out and do topics which otherwise maybe people wouldn't think of as like their first choice, but absolutely you can.
That's nice to hear. Which subject do you like the most, area-related subjects, and why?
Right now, I have a real soft spot for politics Europe because it is taught by Ryan Shave, who is an amazing professor. And I love going to all the lectures. This semester has been so much fun. We dive into topics that are so interesting, like migration politics, but also climate politics, and also especially the welfare state in Europe, which is such a, like, even though we don't think about it as much, the fact that everybody has access, most everybody in Europe has access to public, cheap, and usually basically mandatory insurance, like healthcare insurance, is such an insane thing. And so we dive into those topics a lot. But on the other hand, also, History Europe was so much fun, looking into the ways in which European history was written and the way, like, parts of history which weren't discussed as much. And so all in all, I love all the lectures in Europe. They're amazing. I love all the topics that we cover. They're also amazing. So there's like so much to talk about. I don't know, but I have to pick politics because Brian Shave he's my guy. I love that guy.
No, I get that. And there's a lot of interesting political stuff happening right now in Europe, especially when it comes to climate policy and migration especially. So I get why that would be really interesting to learn. What advantage do you think studying Europe would give you in the job market or in choosing a master or just generally in life?
I suppose it entirely depends on what your plans in the future are. My plans are to stay in Europe. I grew up here. I want to keep living here. I really want to kind of contribute to Europe, however cringy that sounds. I feel like this continent has such a rich history, and especially like it has such an uncertain future, that it's very important for people to study more about this region. And especially if you're seeking employment in Europe, knowing things, especially if you're studying IS, you're probably going into some kind of civil service direction or academia. It's very important to know how Europe works, not just the history, but also the contemporary aspect of it, like how the EU functions, and essentially learning things which might give you an advantage in like picking area of specialization in Europe if you want to go work in the European Parliament or European Commission, or if you want to even work for the International Criminal Court or whichever big international organization you decide to work for. If you're going in that direction, it is very important to have a kind of specialized interest in the continent which you know the most about. And at the same time, if you're doing academia, Europe is going to come up so often every single time you do history that I feel like it's quite important to know like what happened, and especially who made that happen and who is interpreting what's happening.
Yes, definitely. And I also feel like it's nice that you're in Europe. I feel like that gives a kind of advantage to study Europe while you're in Europe, because you can actually see it in daily life. You mentioned the European Union, and obviously the European Union, when you talk about European economics, but also European politics, is a very big player. Do you guys get taught a lot about that, or no?
Yes and no. In some ways, we talk about the European Union a lot, especially European integration, but in the current curriculum, European integration is not taught as much as it was, for instance, last year. The idea for the European program right now, or the European area in IS, is to kind of look at national case studies and find patterns within those national case studies that can be applied to all countries within Europe, and then seeing how these theories work. So, for example, Economics Europe, we look at models of growth, like export-led models of growth, tourism-led models of growth, consumer-driven, etc., etc. And the thing that Europe encourages you to do a lot of the time is to find these outlier cases which don't match that description. And at the same time, in Politics Europe, for instance, we are looking at Europe-wide problems on a national level. So climate policy, for instance, how the Greens in the European Parliament are affecting climate policy, how they have declined but also might return in the future. So even though we don't necessarily name drop the European Union every single time, it's always there in the background. It's always there looking at you, and it's there, and it's an omnipresent thing that you just can't escape because you're in Europe.
Why do you believe students should choose this region to study?
is the best one. I don't think I have to say anything aside from it is the best. But if I would have to give reasons for why it is the best, our lectures are amazing. The course material which we get provided is, I think, even though it is very heavy, it is so easy to absorb and it's easy to get into and it feels like home. That's the thing that, at least for if you're studying in the Netherlands and you're living here, and also if you're from Europe or generally have been living in Europe and you're interested in Europe, it feels like home. It feels like a warm blanket to go into class every day and talk about the places which you're familiar with, but also learning things about those places which you would never otherwise know. And also, if you want to keep living in Europe, I think it's important that you pick up a couple of European languages here and there. You can learn French, Dutch, German, you can do Spanish. So it's, I think, very important for a person to just have, for lack of a better term, just European smarts, Yeah, so there's so many reasons why it's the best. But so many. It is genuinely the best. Do it.
That was a very passionate speech. Do you have a favorite country to study in Europe and why?
Okay. It's a toughie. I love all of them, and I don't want to pick favorites.
What about the country where you live?
We do, especially in politics Europe, we are doing Dutch politics a lot, and Dutch politics is very interesting. But it doesn't have anything on German politics. Sadly, just studying Germany, and especially because it is a country which is, for better or for worse, a central part of European history. It has such a rich history when it comes to everything that happens in Germany. We study, I think, Germany the most just because of its importance. And I have to pick Germany because just the amount of material on Germany and the amount of interesting things that happen in Germany, just following German politics even right now is I'm on the edge of my seat constantly. And the way that German politics works, and especially if you look at the political system and the electoral system and everything, and I don't want to sound like a nerd, but that shit is cool. Yeah, so I have to pick Germany. I'm sorry.
Last question. If you could describe Europe in one word, what would it be?
One word, home.
But maybe for the students that are not from Europe, why would you recommend maybe studying Europe to them then?
It's also your home. You're living here,
yeah.
And you're welcome to come, and you are welcome to study here, and we want you to be here. You are what makes Europe great.
Thank you so much for being here. I feel like it was very interesting to learn about a region that does get presented a bit as maybe boring or easy to understand, and a lot of people feel like they already had so much stuff about Europe in high school, so it is nice to know bit more about it, so thank you.
Thank you for having me.
We have our next guest with us. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Carmela.
And what region do you study?
I study Latin America.
When I ask people who study Latin America about what they think of their region, I always get the same answer, and it's always it's so fun. Can you elaborate on that? Why is it so fun? I've heard that so many times.
So I think that it is a really, really fun region. I mean, you have people from all over the world, a lot of Latin Americans who want to learn more about their own region, like myself. But then also, Europeans or from all over, to be honest. And I think that it's so fun because you have a lot of diversity. Our teachers are very engaged. They're also, a lot of them, from Latin America itself. So they know a lot about it, and it's a really engaging way to teach. And as students, to be honest, it makes everything more fun. And of course, we Latin Americans are known for being fun people.
So just an overall fun atmosphere in the class.
Yeah.
What do you think students who are considering studying this region should know before going to study it?
I think that a lot of people were a bit worried before coming into Latin America because it's often not in high school curriculum, I think especially for Europeans. So I know that can be a bit daunting for some of you. Yeah, of course, if you have a Latin American background, you might know more about the region naturally, and that will make it a bit easier. But you can totally do like perfectly well if you don't know anything about it. Like there's people who have never ever had any contact with like the history, the politics, the economics of the region, and they're doing well and they love it. So don't worry about that. Like it's a course designed for you to learn about it from scratch.
What for you is the most fun thing to learn about Latin America?
I think, okay, I'm from Uruguay, and personally, I think that in my own high school curriculum, we also had a lot more about European history and sometimes not so much about our own region. So I've always been really interested in learning, especially more about other Latin American countries. I feel like I know a lot about mostly the southern cone, but for me, for instance, Central America has been such an enigma because we don't learn about it at all. So I was really excited and it's been really, really fun.
Do you have a favorite area-related subject?
Yeah, I think I would say surprisingly economy. A lot of people say it's the hardest one because of course you have to mix like economic knowledge as well as like the more like context-based knowledge. But honestly, we've had such a good teacher and she is amazing. Honestly, she makes the course so fun. She's very engaging. She knows so much about the topics and she teaches in a way that just suddenly something that is so insanely complex because of course, like, you know, suddenly it just makes sense. So that's been like really nice to have.
Can you give an example of something you learned that's very interesting to you?
Well, personally, I'm very interested in, I've always thought about Latin America as a region with so much potential because we have a lot of natural resources of a lot of different kinds. And for some reason, we're always lagging behind. So I've always been like very interested in that, like how come, you know, how come this happened and how can we change it? So I think it's been very interesting, particularly, in economy, to see about how different economic and political processes throughout the, like, especially 20th century have affected this. I mean, structural adjustment would be like my top one, I guess, especially our relationship with the US and international, like, monetary organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. I think I knew about it before, but at the same time, it's really interesting to look about it in more like specific policies and how that went down.
What do you learn with Latin American culture? Because it's also obviously a very diverse region, because it's very big. You have different groups in Latin America. So could you maybe explain a little bit?
So exactly as you said, I think that the whole endeavor of trying to teach Latin America and the amount of time that the teachers have is like very, very difficult and very ambitious. So of course you cannot possibly cover the 100% of, like, for instance, cultures that you can find, because as you said, we have so many different, like, ethnic, cultural, racial groups that it's very complicated to cover them all. But we focus a lot in, like, the main or, like, the bigger, for instance, indigenous populations. Like, we've talked a lot about the Mapuche people in Chile, so that's also been really interesting personally, because again, from like a Latin American education perspective, we overlook that so much. I mean, I think the only mention that we've ever had about indigenous peoples was like, oh yeah, like they died with the whole process of colonialism, you know, that's with the colonization, like a lot of them died. And there's also this like myth that they're no longer there, you know. I think something that is very clear in Latin American education is how we portray indigenous peoples as something of the past, something that, it's a part of this like very turbulent, very dark past of colonization, how Europeans came and, you know, they massacred or they died because of diseases and whatever, but they're no longer here among us, and that's it. And obviously that's not real. Like, indigenous peoples are still very, very much alive, and they have like this, as you said, insanely rich culture, and they have these different ways of viewing the world and the environment that we could honestly really learn a lot from.
What do you think the biggest misconception from IS students is about Latin America, like studying the region Latin America?
I think sometimes perhaps because especially from Europe, I think that there might be this view of like Latin America tied to the colonial past/present, but yeah. And I think sometimes we leave it at that, It's like, oh yeah, Latin America, and you think natural resources, and you think culture, and you think colonization, and you think that's it. And I feel that robs a lot of like our own agency and how Latin America is like actively living, how you can still find a lot of like diversity, a lot of cultures, a lot of development, I feel like that's the main misconception, just like limiting us to colonialism basically, and then seeing nothing further than that. Of course, like colonialism is still like ingrained like in the structure of how Latin America lives day to day, socially, politically. You can still see that because of course we are a product of history, but I feel like it's really important to view, like in general, all countries of the third world, like quote unquote, and the global south sort of shift our focus and say like, okay, why is it always that we view the global north as the main ones, right? And the other ones is like just backup characters, basically.
Yeah, even like
story.
The term global north and global south.
Exactly.
It's interesting to dissect. Why do you believe students should choose Latin America?
Honestly, it is a really great region. As I said, it's really interesting. I think that it's also something that you don't really generally learn a lot about. As I said, in high school, people don't really see it from what I gather. Sometimes we get lost in how the media portrays, these different regions of the world. So I think a lot of people could benefit from learning from that. At the same time, it is really just so fun. Like, it really, really is so fun. Learning Spanish, learning Portuguese, these are such like interesting, dynamic, fun languages to learn. I also think, if you're thinking about the exchange, you can also go on exchange to Latin America, and how great does that sound? It's insanely nice that you could do that, and you could apply all the knowledge that you've learned so far and really see it in real life. I think that's just this once in a lifetime opportunity, like getting out of your comfort zone. Let's try to study something different. If you're from Europe, maybe choose something that's not Europe for once, and just like try to shift your focus and try to look at how other people live and how other people just view the world, which is honestly very different but really interesting as well.
Okay, last question. If you could describe your region in one song, which song would it be?
One song. This is an insane question. I know this is a very lame answer, and a lot of people might criticize me because there might not be a lot of historical, more like intellectual background to this song. But honestly, La Gozadera de Gente de Zona and Marc Anthony, it's just very song that just, if you're Latin American, you just feel drawn to it. So go and listen it, I would say.
So listeners, go stop the podcast, listen to the song, and come back.
Yes.
Well, thank you for coming. I feel like it was so interesting to talk to you and dive a little bit deeper about Latin America. And from what I gather, it's really fun. Yes. I hear that from everyone around me. So I would encourage the listeners to really explore Latin America as one of your options.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.